Right now, on April 18, Iranian gunboats fired on tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, the same strait Iran declared open just yesterday. Yesterday, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi announced the strait was completely open to all commercial vessels during the ceasefire. Oil prices dropped over 10% on that news alone. Diplomats in Islamabad, Ankara, and Brussels called it a potential turning point. And then, within less than 24 hours, Iran's Revolutionary Guard reversed course and opened fire on a tanker trying to pass through. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre confirmed the incident this morning. Two IRGC gunboats fired on a vessel transiting the strait. The tanker and crew were reported safe, but the ship was forced to turn back. The opening that lasted one day was already finished. Tankertrackers.com reported that an Indian-flagged supertanker, the VLCC Sanmar Herald, was among vessels turned around after coming under fire. Iran's Joint Military Command then issued a formal statement. Control of the Strait of Hormuz has returned to its previous state. In plain terms, that means ships need Iranian naval authorization and toll payment before transiting. The brief opening is canceled. So what exactly happened between Friday's announcement and Saturday's gunfire? Because something collapsed in under 24 hours. Here is the sequence. On April 17th, Iran tied the opening directly to a brand new ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Tehran signaled it was willing to use that diplomatic moment to create momentum toward a broader deal with the United States of America. But the United States did not lift its naval blockade of Iranian ports. The blockade, which began April 14th, remained completely in force. Iran's parliamentary speaker Ghalibaf had warned publicly, without the U.S. lifting its blockade, the Strait of Hormuz would not stay open. That was not a vague threat. It was a stated condition, on the record, 24 hours before the IRGC acted on exactly that condition. Washington did not respond. The blockade continued. And this morning the gunboats moved. The pattern completed itself almost on schedule. What you are watching is not chaos. It is a very specific form of signaling, each side demonstrating which pressure points it controls. Iran controls the strait. The U.S. controls the blockade on Iranian ports. Neither side moves first, and ships absorb the cost every time. Before the war began on February 28th, roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil moved through the Strait of Hormuz every day. That is around 20 million barrels daily. Since the war started, that flow has collapsed, the largest oil supply shock in modern history. The International Energy Agency said this week that resuming Hormuz flows is the single most important variable for the global economy. Not sanctions, not negotiations, not military strikes, the strait itself. And as of this morning, that variable is once again locked shut. The ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran expires on April 22nd, just 4 days from now. Pakistani mediators say a second round is still possible, but today's events make that harder. Every escalation narrows the space for the next conversation. That is the structural trap at work here. If you want to understand why this cycle keeps repeating, why every opening gets canceled, every signal reversed, stay with me on this. Drop a comment. Do you think a deal happens before April 22nd? And hit like if this kind of deep analysis is what you come here for. Let's go. Here is the part that most coverage is missing today. The gunfire this morning was not a surprise. It was the logical conclusion of a failed exchange. On April 17th, Iran's foreign minister declared the strait open. 12 hours later, Trump posted that the U.S. blockade stays in full force regardless. Iran had tied the opening to a condition. The U.S. lifts the port blockade. Washington ignored the condition. The IRGC delivered the consequence. This is not the first time this pattern is played out. It is repeated on almost a weekly cycle since the war began on February 28th. Each time a diplomatic signal appears, a counter-move follows within hours. Each move is calibrated. Each one is designed to preserve leverage. What this tells us, and I think this is the key insight, is that neither side actually wants the strait resolved on the other's terms. The strait is not a problem both sides are trying to solve. It is a bargaining chip both sides are refusing to release at the same time. For Iran, keeping the strait in play means keeping global economic pressure pointed at Washington as much as at Tehran. That is their leverage. For the U.S., the port blockade is the counter-pressure, squeezing Iranian oil revenue while technically not closing international navigation. But here is what the economic data is showing us right now, and these are not opinions. These are figures from the IEA's April 2026 report. Before the war, more than 20 million barrels of oil per day transited Hormuz. By early April, that figure had fallen to around 3.8 million. Global oil supply dropped by 10 million barrels per day in March alone. The IEA called it the largest disruption in the history of oil markets. The average price of a gallon of gasoline in the United States was $2.98 on February 28th. By mid-April, it had risen to $4.11 per AAA data. Analysts at the Quincy Institute told CNBC that a sustained blockade could push Brent crude toward $150 per barrel. Some analysts believe that estimate is conservative. The IMF has already cut its 2026 global growth forecast. For the Middle East and North Africa specifically, the cut was 2.8 percentage points. Iran's own economy is projected to contract by over 6% this year. But the pain is not staying in the region. It is spreading fast. European gas storage came into this crisis at just 30% capacity after a harsh winter. Dutch TTF gas benchmarks nearly doubled by mid-March. The Philippines declared a national energy emergency and moved to a 4-day workweek. Japan released historic emergency petroleum reserves. South Korea sent a special envoy directly to Tehran to negotiate passage for its vessels. France and Italy are doing the same, bypassing Washington. In other words, U.S. allies are not waiting for American policy to work. They are individually negotiating with Iran because they cannot afford to wait. That is a structural fracture in the Western position, not because of ideology, but because energy costs are a political emergency in those countries. And in my view, that fracture is one of the most underreported consequences of the last 7 weeks. The alliance architecture is bending under price pressure. Every week this continues, more countries find their own separate arrangements with Tehran. That is not a coalition holding. That is a coalition dissolving. The blockade was designed to isolate Iran, but the economic pressure it generates is quietly pushing U.S. partners to make individual deals with the very country the blockade targets. Now let's talk about the 3 players who are not Iran and not the United States, because they may determine how this ends more than either side. The first is Russia. And the Russia story here is one that almost nobody in Western media is covering with the attention it deserves right now. In the first quarter of 2026, 90% of Russia's total crude oil exports went to China and India, according to shipping and trade data. Before the war, Russia was struggling. Oil revenues were falling. The Kremlin was preparing budget adjustments. Then, February 28th happened. When Hormuz closed and global supply collapsed, demand for Russian crude surged. Moscow did not fire a shot, and its energy revenues soared. Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov said this week in Beijing that Russia can fill any energy gap for China and other interested partners. His words. That is not a geopolitical statement. That is a sales pitch, and it is being delivered at the exact moment when China most needs to hear it. The second player is China. Beijing called the U.S. blockade a dangerous and irresponsible act, unusually direct language for Chinese diplomacy. China's crude oil imports from Iran account for a significant share of its total supply. The blockade cuts that supply off. Beijing feels this directly. But China also has leverage that few other countries hold. It sits on massive strategic oil reserves. It has time in a way that smaller nations do not. And here is the strategic risk that analysts at CNBC and Eurasia Group have flagged explicitly: a U.S. interception of a Chinese vessel at sea. David Meal of Eurasia Group said it clearly. If that happens, it becomes a major incident that leaves the U.S.-China relationship fundamentally changed. Trump is scheduled to visit China in mid-May. Washington has been carefully managing the bilateral relationship to keep that summit on track. The blockade puts that in jeopardy. Every day it continues is a day closer to a miscalculation at sea that no diplomatic calendar can absorb. The third player is Pakistan. And Pakistan's role in this crisis is genuinely remarkable for a country rarely at the center of global energy diplomacy. Pakistani Army Chief Asim Munir flew to Tehran this week as a direct intermediary, a trusted channel between Washington and the Iranian government. Pakistani PM Sharif is traveling to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey this week to build diplomatic support for a second round of negotiations. Pakistan is simultaneously holding the trust of both sides in a war between 2 nuclear-armed powers and one of the world's most sanctioned states. That is an extraordinary diplomatic position, and it means that if a second round of talks happens before April 22nd, Pakistan will have made it happen. The April 22nd ceasefire deadline is now 4 days away. No second round of talks has been officially scheduled as of this morning, April 18. Secretary of State Rubio said today that Iran is approaching nuclear weapon capability and urged Europe to reimpose sanctions immediately. Iran's first vice president Arif said Tehran will defend its control of the Strait of Hormuz, either at the negotiating table or on the battlefield. Those 2 statements, both made today, describe opposite directions. One side is escalating the pressure, the other is hardening its position. And the ships are still turning back. The VLCC Sanmar Herald, which had received prior clearance to pass, was fired on this morning anyway. In my view, what we are watching is a negotiation conducted through action rather than language, and today's action said something very loud. So let me bring this together. Because the pattern we have watched today is not new, but it is accelerating, and the window to resolve it is closing. 7 weeks ago, the Strait of Hormuz carried 20% of the world's oil. Today, it is carrying a fraction of that. The IEA calls it historic. The IEA's head, Fatih Birol, said this is the worst energy shock the world has ever seen, more severe than the 1970s oil crisis and Ukraine combined. Daniel Yergin of S&P Global said there has never been anything of this scale. These are not analysts known for hyperbole. That is the baseline we are at. And yet, as of April 18th, the two sides are not closer to a deal than they were a week ago. In some ways, the gap has widened since this morning. The nuclear question remains the core sticking point. Vance said Iran would not commit to abandoning a path toward a nuclear weapon. Iran denied it. Netanyahu said publicly this week that Washington and Jerusalem both demand Iran hand over its 970 pounds of highly enriched uranium and end enrichment. Iran's position, stated consistently, is that enrichment is a sovereign right, and that no deal eliminating it entirely is on the table for Tehran. That gap did not open this week. It has existed since the talks in Islamabad on April 12th. It may exist on April 22nd when the ceasefire expires. So what happens on April 22nd if there is no deal? Trump said it clearly this week. If no agreement, the US may start dropping bombs again. His words. Iran's supreme leader Mojtaba Khamenei said his navy is ready to inflict new, bitter defeats on enemies. That statement came out this morning. Pakistani mediators, Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia are all working to prevent that scenario. That is a significant amount of diplomatic weight. But diplomatic weight does not override a deadline. And a deadline with no agreed extension is a different kind of pressure than anything we have seen. Here's what I think the structural reality looks like right now. And I want to be clear, this is analytical interpretation, not prediction. Both sides have demonstrated today that they are willing to signal and then reverse within 24 hours. That is actually useful information. It tells us the conflict is still being managed at the margins. The fact that Iran declared it open and then closed it again means both options exist. If Iran were truly committed to permanent closure, it would not have opened it at all. The opening, even brief, was a message about what is possible. Similarly, the US blockade targets Iranian ports, not all navigation. That distinction matters. It is a pressure tool, not a declaration of total war. The question is whether the people in the room on April 22nd, or before, can find a formula that lets both sides claim enough to step back from the edge. The ceasefire has held imperfectly. Ships have been fired on. The blockade is running. But the bombs have stopped falling on Iranian soil since April 7. That matters. Imperfect as it is, the ceasefire created a structure. And structures, even fragile ones, are harder to destroy than they look from the outside. What the next 4 days will test is whether the diplomatic infrastructure, Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, the back channels, can hold that structure together. The energy markets are already pricing in uncertainty. Brent crude is hovering near $95, even after yesterday's brief drop on the opening announcement. Every day of uncertainty costs something. For global shipping, for energy markets, for the countries who depend on both. The meter is running right now. What happens next in the Strait of Hormuz will shape global energy, global trade, and the architecture of international diplomacy for years to come. This is one of those moments where the outcome is genuinely unclear, and where paying attention to the system, not just the headlines, is what matters. That is what this channel is here for. If you found this useful, share it with someone who is trying to understand what is actually happening right now. Subscribe if you are not already. There is more coming as this situation develops. And leave your read on April 22nd in the comments. I will be in there.